I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is continuing his efforts to sabotage the Gaza ceasefire and exchange of captives deal. And while Netanyahu does this, Hamas has started to put out its own substantive public proposals for what it believes is a pathway to an enduring permanent truce in Gaza that would allow reconstruction of the Strip. On Tuesday, Hamas's Gaza chief, Khalil al-Hayya, said the group was prepared to negotiate a comprehensive deal for phase two of the ceasefire framework that would include the return of all Israeli captives held in Gaza as one package, rather than staggered weekly releases that have been common in phase one of this deal, where three people are exchanged for large numbers of Palestinians being held by Israel. In return for this proposal, Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups would want Israel to completely withdraw all of its forces from the Gaza Strip and for international mediators, including the United States, to certify that a long-term truce was in effect that would allow the reconstruction. Now, it should be said, this was already in the deal. So in a way, Israel's sabotage has now caused them to go back and now say, hey, we want just the actual deal that we agreed to be implemented. But such is the nature of Israel's tactics so far in these negotiations. Dr. Ahaya said that Hamas and the resistance have demonstrated their seriousness in implementing the agreement with full responsibility. This is a quote, while Israeli occupation forces and Netanyahu's government keep responding with procrastination and attempts to evade its implementation. We should point out, because this isn't often mentioned in Western media, that Israel has systematically violated this ceasefire since it went into effect on January 19th. More than 130, and this is a conservative estimate, Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the ceasefire went into effect. Israel is still continuing to block the delivery of heavy equipment that could be used to clear rubble, to create spaces for Palestinians to try to rebuild some structure to live in as they wait for a more full reconstruction. Israel's also blocking the delivery of higher quality tents. Many Palestinians are using just shreds of nylon and other things to try to build tents. And then there are tens of thousands of mobile homes that are supposed to be let into the Gaza Strip that are not. On Tuesday of this week, the mayor of Rafah said that Israeli forces killed two Palestinians and then snatched two others and brought them back to Israel. But we are in a moment where on Thursday, Hamas and other resistance groups handed over to Israel the remains of four Israeli captives who are no longer living. Among these are Shiri Bibas and her two children, Ariel and Kafir Bibas. You might remember that back in November of 2023, the Qassam brigades announced that they had been killed in an Israeli airstrike. Israel was aware of this, and yet a campaign that was clearly aimed at emotional manipulation to imply that they were still alive was ratcheted up, particularly in the past weeks and months. And people who want Israel to resume a full-scale war against Gaza are really cynically using this case in an effort to try to push forward with their agenda. Now, as a result of these proposals that Hamas made, not just the idea of an omnibus deal in the second phase, but also releasing 6 living Israeli captives on Saturday, which Hamas said it would do. This is, in the eyes of Hamas, showing flexibility. And we understand that Israel has agreed now to start letting in some of that aid, heavy equipment, mobile homes that it's been delaying. But with Netanyahu, you never quite know what is actually going to happen. He recently placed his longtime confidant and strategic affairs minister, Ron Dermer, in charge of the negotiations at phase two. This means someone who's a political operative close to Netanyahu is now going to be in charge versus historically it's been the head of Shin Bet and other Israeli intelligence agencies that have been taking the lead on these negotiations. There is a lot to discuss, and we're very happy to be joined by Abdul Jawad Omar. He's an adjunct professor at Birzeit University and a writer. You can read him regularly in the publication Mondoweiss. He's based in Ramallah. Abdul Jawad, thank you so much for being with us here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jeremy.
So I just ran through a lot there, and we'll unpack some of this. But first, I just want to ask you about the recent TikTok of events that has taken place, where you had the Qassam brigades saying, just a week or so ago, look, Israel is violating the agreement, so we're not going to release any more Israeli captives until they stop. Trump then intervenes and makes it sound like the full-scale war is going to resume again. And then at the 11th hour, an agreement was made. Hamas did, in fact, return 3 Israeli captives. Israel then released a large number of Palestinians. And now we're in this situation where phase one, in terms of the exchange, seems to be coming to a close, and there's big questions about what's going to happen in phase two. Your thoughts about these developments that have gone down over the past 2 weeks?
Well, I mean, since the outset of, agreeing on the ceasefire itself, it was fragile because Israel retained two important elements from the perspective of resistance group. One is the threat of looming war, so or returning to war, and that's one that as we proceed to the end days of the 42 days ceasefire agreement, the resistance groups would naturally tilt towards not releasing more prisoners if this agreement will not be extended. So it wasn't surprising to see that Hamas and other resistance groups would declare that they would hesitate to release more prisoners if there's no real guarantees by the mediators and also by Israel itself, including the United States and Qatar and Egypt and other actors, that there would be continued negotiation or at least an agreement, initial agreement that would see all parties agree that a second phase would be negotiated over and would be extended, and the war will not return to its full intensity anytime soon. So I think that's what happened last week. And that's why the resistance groups did what they did. They signaled that they're not going to play this game if Israel remain reticent, if it does not give entry to important components for the enhancing living conditions for the people in Gaza, including the caravans and the heavy equipments and things that would help clear the rubble, as you were saying in your opening remarks. So I think that's exactly what the resistance group wanted, and I think to some degree, seeing that the negotiations continued behind closed doors, there's some sort of guarantees for that. Although perhaps the resistance groups were also pragmatic enough to release even more prisoners to ensure that this agreement will be extended and we will see a phase two of the agreement.
Now, I mean, the most valuable assets that the resistance groups hold, of course, are the Israeli captives, particularly the Israeli soldiers, and those people generally are being reserved for a phase two of the deal. What do you make, though, of what Dr. Khalil Al-Haya offered up this week, which was an all-in-one deal, which Donald Trump has said he wants, where they would return all of the remaining Israeli captives and the remains of those that are no longer living? It seems like a dangerous proposal from a tactical perspective on the part of Hamas and other groups, because if they return all of the captives, there's nothing then to stop Israel from just full scale resuming the war. Is there something else at play here that isn't so obvious?
Well, I think, Jeremy, you're quite right, but at the same time, you should remember that we Palestinians have had a tough time dealing with these kind of protracted, phased out agreements. Oslo was an agreement like that. It was based on phases. There was also one, also two, Camp David, continuous negotiations for negotiation's sake. So the resistance and Hamas in this case, is interested in a comprehensive agreement that would see a total end of the war, that would actually put an outline, a real outline for the reconstruction of Gaza. And based on that, I don't think that Hamas would mind to do an all-for-all exchange agreement, a prisoners exchange agreement that would end, it having this card or this leverage, which is the Israeli captives and prisoners, including the soldiers among it. That's one element of this statement. The second element, I think, Hamas is now interested in also showing the people of Gaza and Palestinian people more broadly that it's pragmatic enough that it does not want the return of the war, that it will not be that reticent in negotiations, but it will still maintain red lines that are important and fundamental for the Palestinian people moving on, including the reconstruction of Gaza, including ensuring that the lifting of the siege, including things that the Palestinians in Gaza direly need at this critical juncture.
What do you make of Donald Trump's bombastic sort of intervention where he's saying, "Oh, the United States is going to take Gaza. We don't even need to buy it from anyone. We're just going to take it. We're going to make a Middle East Riviera." You're a student of American politics as well. What is your read on that play from Trump and what's actually at heart? I mean, do you think Trump actually believes this, or is he using this to try to put pressure on Egypt, Jordan, Gulf countries? What's at play here? What's your assessment?
Well, I think there's multiple elements. We can, we can take this kind of psychological discursive approach to analyzing this, and I think, having known Americans and American politics on some level, I would say that there is always this can-do attitude among Americans that, Trump also embody with this, will take over Gaza, no? And of course, with Trump himself, looking at land as a commodity form, looking at it as simply something to be invested in, which is, we have a different relationship in Palestine to land than looking at it only as a commodity form or a real estate development. But that's what Trump was kind of expressing, this kind of New York real estate attitude, and at the same time can-do attitude. I think also the idea of Americans taking over Gaza was kind of was kind of a rebuke of Netanyahu on the podium. It was meant to say that, there's tension between these two figures, and Trump didn't want to give Netanyahu too much credence. So this is why he said America will take it over, not Israel. No, there's something along those lines going on in the tension. So these are the three elements. But I think what is more important from the Israeli perspective of what Trump is saying and doing is that he's setting the agenda. And Jeremy, you've seen this with Trump throughout the decade of his engagement in American politics, is that when he speaks of immigration, for instance, into the United States, it becomes the agenda of the media, the political machine, the Congress. Everybody's talking about illegal immigration. Everybody's talking about building the wall or not building the wall. So Trump has the ability to set the agenda. And there's this ambition among right-wing Israeli elements, including people like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Netanyahu, and others, to basically set an agenda in the coming century or in the coming years and months that the Palestinian cause can only, and the Palestinian issue can be only solved by the total eradication of the physical presence of Palestinians on the land of Palestine. And that includes not only Gaza, that includes also Palestinians in the West Bank where I live, and Palestinians in Jerusalem, and even in some cases or in some instances also Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that's the agenda that this right-wing messianic movement wants to actually enact. And to get that, it needs Arab approval, because there's an architecture in the region that America maintains. This is where Egypt and Jordan comes in, where Saudi Arabia comes in. They need to also agree on some sort of solution that would see the end of Palestinian physical presence. And Trump is a useful persona to set that agenda from the biggest podium in the world, which is the White House podium.
I'm sure you're familiar that at recent cabinet meetings, Netanyahu said that the kind of red line for Israel going into phase two negotiations is that Hamas needs to leave Gaza and that it needs to be entirely disarmed. At the same time, you've had this intra-Palestinian dialogue with many different political parties, movements, factions meeting, and Mustafa Barghouti has been drafting a lot of the position papers that they've been signing. Interestingly, in almost all of these, Fatah, the ruling coalition of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, has not been participating in them. But Dr. Barghouti and others have said Hamas has told other Palestinian groups it doesn't want to govern Gaza, that it will accept a national unity committee of some form, but also that Hamas is not going to go away and that it is not going to just lay down its arms as a resistance movement. Talk about some of these dynamics that are going on, because they don't get much coverage in the broader media, but there was just a huge meeting of Palestinian groups in Doha in recent days. No press coverage of it. Talk a bit about those dynamics, the fact that Israel is saying condition is that Hamas needs to leave and disarm, and then you also have many Palestinian groups trying to come up with their own indigenous solution for how to handle Gaza in the aftermath of this genocidal war.
Well, look, from the perspective of Hamas, it has two, I think, objectives in the negotiations now. It does not want to give Israel any political success that it could not achieve in war itself. So as we move on from a ceasefire agreement that stops the intensity of violence, at least for the moment, and we talk about a more permanent political arrangement, Hamas does not want to give Israel or cede to Israel something that it could not achieve through the war, which is a total destruction of the movement, the armed movement as well, and the resistance in Gaza. And they want to maintain the presence of resistance, but I think Hamas is also pragmatic enough to realize that it also has to perhaps abdicate, its role as a governance entity within the Gaza Strip. This is how Hamas will lead this negotiation. It will enter these negotiations, hoping to be able to achieve or to guarantee its presence as a resistance movement within the Gaza Strip, to maintain some influence over war and peace in the Gaza Strip and the decisions for war and peace, but at the same time to hand over governance in education, health, reconstruction, and all of other elements to perhaps other political formations within the Palestinian political field, including in this instance Fatah, or a technocratic government that is formed on a unity basis. The second element that I think many of the political groups want to really achieve, or at least some of them want to achieve, is a form of unity which will actually deny Israel the claim that the Palestinians are divided. So if we're speaking, for instance, about two states, or we're speaking, for instance, about the possibility of ending the conflict on some sort of basis that actually guarantees Palestinian self-determination, dignity, even if it's a minimum basis of these rights, the Palestinians will have to get their act together and form some sort of unity government and some sort of political agenda that they can present to the world and present to Israel and present to all parties concerned with what's going on in Palestine. And there's a lot of initiatives around that, partially also in the Doha agreement. However, having said that, I think that there's going to be a lot of reticence on the part of Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, who think unity is also a dangerous game and gambit to play. They don't want to play that game. They want to maintain their hold over the West Bank without sharing power with any other political group. They want to maintain this kind of authoritarian regime that dictates policies and hammers down against resistance in the West Bank and maintains security coordination, and denies now, for instance, in the past week, also payment and salaries for martyrs' families and prisoners' families. It wants to maintain this kind of dictatorial authoritarian regime. And since at least 2007, part of that regime is built on enmity not towards Israel, but enmity towards Hamas. This is the declared enemy of the Palestinian Authority. So I doubt, I'm very cynical towards whether these groups will be able to achieve this kind of unity. And also because I think on some level, part of the Palestinian current political elite in the West Bank would want to also pursue the Israeli agenda of actually disarming Hamas in the Gaza Strip as a precondition for them taking over power. So I think that will be a hard nut to sell, or a hard sell or a hard bargain going forward in talks with Hamas in the Gaza Strip at this moment. And I think the last thing I will say, Jeremy, on this is that Hamas also wants to show the Palestinian people in Gaza that it's willing to abdicate power, that it's not clinging to power itself, that it's not interested in maintaining its governance in Gaza, or maintaining this kind of governance structure, that it's willing to give that up and to ensure the reconstruction moves forward.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the occupied West Bank and the role of the PA. Mariam Barghouti has been doing some really good reporting for us from Jenin and elsewhere. And just to remind people that within the past couple of months, you've seen a real intensification of the Palestinian Authority's security forces laying siege to Jenin in the name of trying to wipe out Palestinian resistance groups, but it's operated basically overtly in concert with the Israelis imposing their own intense siege, invasions, occupations. And of course, then you have illegal settlers who are clearly backed by the government coming in this period as well. Ironically, we learned this week that that Donald Trump's administration is freezing the funding to the Palestinian Authority security forces. I say ironic because they've basically acted as agents of the Israeli occupation, and now Trump is saying, "Well, we're gonna stop financing their operations." But talk about this reality right now in the occupied West Bank, where you have the Israelis displacing forcibly tens of thousands of Palestinians from their home, snatching hundreds of people and disappearing them into Israeli prisons. And then you have a decrepit Abbas who has popularity ratings in the toilet, is becoming very, very old. What is going to happen in the West Bank? What happens if Abbas dies at this moment? What does it mean to the Palestinians of the occupied West Bank that you have the Palestinian Authority in such an open way colluding with a very violent siege that Israel is laying in the area?
Well, look, I think one of the outcomes of, the violence, the massacres and the genocide that Israel has committed in Gaza, for 15 months, Gaza has been bombed relentlessly, and Palestinians in the West Bank and in Jerusalem and everywhere else have been witnessing how Israel was able to get away with this form of intense massacres and still backed by the United States with weapons and diplomatic cover and legal cover. And I think one of the messages that Israel wanted to send, not to the people of Gaza only, but to Palestinians everywhere, is that if you dare and resist or rebel, that you will have this disastrous, if you want, catastrophic outcome in terms of we unleashing the killing machine. And that has provided some room for those in Palestinian society, including Fatah and the current elite, who call for cooperation with Israel as the basis for survival, to start implementing policies they wouldn't have been able to implement in any other context. And part of that is colluding directly and openly with Israeli army in Jenin, for instance. Part of that is, denying Palestinian prisoners and families of martyrs, their financial rights that has been codified since the 1990s in the Palestinian governance apparatus. So, in a nutshell, this is a moment where the voice for cooperation has some sort of, if you want, echo because of this desire to survive, to remain. That's one element, at least, of the dynamic, and that's what explains, at least, that despite the fact that the Palestinian Authority is colluding openly, that we haven't seen signs of the outbreak of rebellion, despite the lack of popularity of the Palestinian Authority and its security apparatus, more precisely in the West Bank at this current moment. So that's one element of it, Jeremy. The second, I think, important element, which you touched upon, this is kind of the contradictory position of Israel towards the Palestinian Authority, that despite the Palestinian Authority's best operational practices, serving Israeli security, ensuring that Palestinians in the West Bank do not rebel or do not create the conditions for an intifada, despite the fact that the Palestinian Authority does all of this security coordination, that it symbolically recognizes Israel, that it symbolically recognizes the right of Israel to exist. Despite this whole series of concessions that this Palestinian ruling elite has given Israel, at the end of the day, the Israeli right-wing government and Israel more broadly does not want the Palestinian Authority. It does not want the Palestinians, full stop. So what we see is that despite the need for the Palestinian Authority on the one level to maintain security arrangement, that there's still an interest in Israel and among people like Trump to still weaken the PA further, to delegitimize it further, to make it a hollow institution even further, because eventually the plan is, as Trump was saying, is the ethnic cleansing or the genociding of the Palestinian people. So they don't want the Palestinian Authority, they don't want any form of dependency on Palestinians, even if that dependency is on security cooperation. And that's also part of the political dynamic that you see, the tension between somebody like Smotrich, who depends on the PA to ensure that there's colonialism and the buildup of settlements in the West Bank without much resistance, but at the same time, his real aim and desire to see no Palestinians in the West Bank at all.
I want to talk a bit about also the freeing of Palestinians who were snatched by Israel or imprisoned by Israel for very long terms. One of the things that we've seen is that Israel has taken thousands of Palestinians from Gaza, apparently to just use for the sole purpose of these exchange deals. For instance, in the exchange that's happening on Thursday, there's going to be 200, we understand, Palestinian women and children who were taken since October 7th from Gaza and have just been held essentially as hostages. They're going to be part of the exchange happening on Tuesday. But also, you have approximately 50 Palestinian political prisoners who are serving life sentences, and then almost an equal number serving very long prison sentences that are going to be released. And I understand from sources that I've spoken with who are on the Palestinian side of these negotiations and mediation efforts that in the next phase, there is quite a lot of hope that Marwan Barghouti, who is probably the best known internationally Palestinian political prisoner. He's not from Hamas. He's not from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. His roots are actually from Fatah, but he is viewed widely as someone that could be a potentially unifying figure. Ahmed Sadat from the Party for the Liberation of Palestine, from the PFLP. He's one of the longest serving political prisoners. He could well be released in the second phase. But what I wanted to mention was that I've been told that Israel wants to deport a lot of these people. They don't want them going to the occupied West Bank or to East Jerusalem or to Gaza. They want them out of the country. And the resistance negotiators have said that their position is they will not make that decision for individual prisoners, that the individual Palestinians who are potentially going to be freed have to be the ones to decide if they will take a deportation agreement. A couple of weeks ago, there was at least one Palestinian who said, I will not be deported. The Israelis said, fine, then you're going back to prison, and they swapped him out for another prisoner. But as of this moment, Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat are on the list for phase two. The Israelis could veto it. They've done it before. But I want to ask you about the significance of some of these very high profile Palestinian political prisoners from a variety of factions. But let's start with Marwan Barghouti. What would the significance be if Marwan Barghouti is freed as part of these negotiations and he does return to the occupied West Bank? What does that mean for the future of Palestinian politics, organizing? How significant would it be to have him out and in public?
Well, it would really depend on what Marwan plans to do. I mean, that's one element of it. I mean, if he plans to, becoming politically active, what form of position he will take. The ground is laid for Marwan to have some role, specifically a unifying role. He represents perhaps the old spirit of Fatah, which is one that is pragmatic and sought negotiations with Israel on one level, but at the same time still retained the right and the capacity to resist on the other. So he represents that kind of direction within Fatah that has been missing for the past 17 years or so. And his return and his ability and his legitimacy also within the social base of Fatah itself, but also more broadly among Palestinian society, could potentially be disruptor to the current ruling classes of the Palestinian Authority. It could change the dynamic slightly, but to be honest as well, the current apparatus is very strong. It had years of purging people from within its ranks. It has years of turning people into retirement, those who wanted a different type of policy. It has years of testing the loyalty of people within the security apparatus on whether they will heed orders when they're given orders. It had years of creating an environment that is antagonistic towards any form of resistance, any form of politics that is revolutionary within the Palestinian context. So I think that would also be a tough thing for Marwan or others to come and broach or break the hold that the current ruling classes have over the Palestinian Authority. But I think it would be significant, specifically that what we're seeing also, Jeremy, is the return of some of the figures of a bygone era, like the second intifada, the intifada that was also in Gaza and the West Bank. And these are figures, both political and social, that people have trust in and perhaps can actually move forward and create the conditions for a Palestinian politics that moves more towards a politics of confrontation and defiance and sumud, which means steadfastness. Yeah.
As we wrap up, I want to ask you a sort of very big picture question. The overarching impact of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, which was the name that Hamas gave to the operations on October 7th, 2023. What is your assessment of the impact that those operations and then the subsequent genocidal war are going to have on the future of the Palestinian liberation movement? It's a big question, and you can take it in the direction that you want. But I'm asking it in the context of Hamas's own manifesto, and when you talk to officials from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, they portray it. They say that this was a war of defense, and that from their perspective, the cause of Palestine was getting crushed by the Israelis, that the normalization agreements were moving forward, that the conditions inside of the Gaza concentration camp were becoming more dire, and that hopelessness was setting in. That was their perspective. But I wonder what your assessment is now of how history is going to view that action and the subsequent genocidal war.
Well, I think on one level, this question is too early to actually really answer fully. I do kind of concur. The Palestinian cause was it was kind of eroding. The region was heading towards normalization. We've seen also signs socially within Palestine itself of people moving away from the collective dream of Palestine, the rise of, for example, criminal gangs among Palestinian citizens of Israel, the politics of cooperation among the ruling classes in the West Bank that technicized the relationship with Israel, made it about security cooperation, not seeking a state, not really doing anything proactive to achieve that. And we've seen also disruptors not from within the Palestinian political field, but from within Israel itself that want to revise the entire relationship and the paradigm that governs the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, despite how horrendous it is today, which is in the forces that now spearhead the Zionist movement more broadly, people like Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich that are leading voices in the Israeli government, who want to disrupt that relationship and who were speaking well before October 7th about a decisive plan to end the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian presence on the land of Palestine. Smotrich was very generous to give the Palestinian three options: either become slaves and accept the sovereignty of Israel, or kill us because we will resist, or we can leave Palestine. These are the three choices that he gave the Palestinians. So there were signs in many ways that would prompt an armed resistance movement that has been accumulating power in the Gaza Strip to take a proactive approach and conduct an operation that also saw a regional configuration in terms of different political parties participating in this Tufan al-Aqsa, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Ansar Allah in Yemen, Iran, and some parties and movements in Iraq and other places. So the Palestinians were able to disrupt. There was a surgence of Palestine in the international scene. I think Israel has lost its moral and political standing among many people across the world. There's new generations that are politicized in the global north, but also in the global south through the issue of Palestine itself. I think in the years to come, there's a lot of opportunities for the Palestinian liberation struggle, but that also depends on whether the Palestinians remain steadfast, whether they remain also politically vigilant and aware, and remain or maintain the hope that something will change down the road. And I think one of the significant also impacts of the Tufan al-Aqsa will be on Israeli society itself. The internal implosion, the relationship between the various, if you want, political forces within Israel itself, the continuous intensified struggle between this kind of liberal left of center in Israel and the right wing. I think that will still play a big role in the future of Israel itself, specifically after the failure of October 7th, quite expose that the Israeli military and Israeli intelligence are defeatable. This is one of the significant impacts, at least, of Tufan al-Aqsa moving forward. But having said that, also Israel has succeeded in changing the strategic environment in its northern borders. It has weakened and battered Hezbollah. It has weakened and battered also Hamas. It has destroyed Gaza, and at least for now, it gets away with it, conducting this genocidal war. It's attempting to still pursue a policy proactively of ethnically cleansing or making Gaza in the long term unlivable, so Palestinians will slowly and assuredly move away from it. So the dangers are not really cleared, and we're still in the height of the battle, because the battle that was going on for the past 15 months on the ground in terms of violence is now a political battle to see how the future turns out, at least for the moment, in the short term and the medium run. And hopefully it will slowly and assuredly turn towards the arc will turn towards Palestinian retaining justice and achieving their liberty.
Abdul Jawad Omar is an adjunct professor at Birzeit University and a writer based in Ramallah. You can see some of his work at websites like Mondoweiss. And he also did a really interesting discussion recently with Mondoweiss and Al Shabaka, the Palestinian think tank that we'll also link to. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And that does it for this special broadcast. Make sure to subscribe. You can do it for free at dropsitenews.com. You can also become a paid subscriber, though we don't put anything behind a paywall. It just is our readers that fuel our journalism. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill.